In this video, we're going to take a look at bad thesis statements and how to make them better. This information was adapted from the Cal State University Northridge website. The first type of bad thesis is the non-thesis thesis. You see, a thesis is supposed to take a position on an issue. It's different from a topic sentence in that a thesis statement is not neutral. It announces, in addition to the topic, the argument you want to make or the point you want to prove. This is your own opinion that you intend to back up, and this is your reason and motivation for writing. So here's a good example of a bad thesis. In his article, Stanley Fish shows that we don't really have the right to free speech. The problem here is that is exactly what the article says, and that's a statement of fact. There's no opinion on the part of the writer. Try this one. Stanley Fish's argument that free speech exists more as a political prize than as a legal reality ignores the fact that even as a political prize, it still serves the social end of creating a general cultural atmosphere of tolerance that may ultimately promote free speech in our nation just as effectively as any binding law. Now, this is a fairly complicated thesis statement, but you'll notice it's very specific. It doesn't talk about Stanley Fish's entire argument, just that the idea that it exists more as a political prize than as a legal reality ignores the fact that it's still useful. You may or may not be able to write something this complicated, but you can see how this would be a much more interesting paper than one that just basically regurgitates everything Stanley Fish has to say. Here's an example. This paper will consider the advantages and disadvantages of certain restrictions on free speech. If you're going to just say, I'm going to consider how it's good and how it's bad, that's a problem, okay? You have to choose. And even though there may be considerable advantages to restricting hate speech, the possibility of chilling open dialogue on crucial racial issues is too great and too high a price to pay. Again, this is a very specific type of free speech that we're talking about here. And that makes this a much more exciting and interesting paper. You can also do an overly broad thesis statement. See, a thesis should be as specific as possible and it should be tailored to reflect the scope of the paper. It's not possible, for instance, to write about the history of English literature in a 5-page paper. In addition to choosing simply a smaller topics, strategies to narrow a thesis include specifying a method or perspective or delineating certain limits. So, Bad Thesis 1 wants to do that. It says there are no restrictions on the First Amendment. There actually are, but this is not very specific anyway. There should be no restrictions on the First Amendment if those restrictions are intended merely to protect individuals from unspecified or otherwise unquantifiable or unverifiable emotional distress. Okay? Again, this is a very specific way of saying there should be no restrictions. However, the government has the right to limit free speech. Well, this is a bad thesis because it really doesn't, for one thing, except in certain cases, and you're not even going to talk about those. How about this? The government has the right to limit free speech in cases of overtly racist or sexist language because our failure to address such abuses would effectively suggest that our society condones such ignorant and hateful views. Again, very specific, and I have to point out too, it's very obviously arguable. A person could reasonably disagree with this, and this is your opinion, and you can back it up with some source material. Then there's the uncontestable thesis, meaning nobody could really argue with it. A thesis must be arguable, and in order for it to be arguable, it must present a view that someone might reasonably contest. Sometimes a thesis ultimately says, we should be good, or bad things are bad. Such thesis statements are so universally accepted that there's no need to prove the point. So a bad one would be, although we have the right to say what we want, we should avoid hurting other people's feelings. That's not really arguable. I think we know that we should avoid hurting other people's feelings, but if we can accept that emotional injuries can be just as painful as physical ones, we should limit speech that may hurt people's feelings in ways similar to the way we limit speech that may lead directly to bodily harm. Now, obviously, this is highly arguable, and yet it's something that someone could produce an argument in favor of and just as easily argue against from the other side. How about this one? There are always alternatives to using racist speech. This is a statement of fact. Nobody really is going to argue the fact there are alternatives, always. Better, the fighting words exception to free speech is not legitimate because it wrongly considers speech as an action. Now, you may not know that fighting words is something that the Supreme Court, a long time ago, decided was something where free speech could be restricted. There is such a thing as fighting words, and this is going to say that the fighting words exception is not legitimate, and why. Now you can see again this is highly arguable, and that's what we're looking for. Now you've been perhaps coached to use this, the list essay thesis. A good argumentative thesis provides not only a position on an issue, but also suggests the structure of the paper. The thesis should allow the reader to imagine and anticipate the flow of the paper in which a sequence of points logically prove the essay's main assertion. A list essay provides no such structure, so that different points and paragraphs appear arbitrary with no logical connection to one another. So this is a bad thesis, and it's the type of list thesis you may have gotten good points on in high school. We need to limit hate speech because 1. It normalizes prejudice and discrimination. 2. It encourages violence against certain populations. And 3. It is un-American. Okay, I put in the 1, 2, 3 there, but you can see how this is the list you've been perhaps coached to create. One in which you outline every single thing you're going to say without really showing any of the connective tissue. Here's this one is better. Among the many reasons we need to limit hate speech, the most compelling ones all refer to our history of discrimination and prejudice. And it is ultimately for the purpose of trying to repair our troubled racial society that we need hate speech legislation. Okay, you can see what the argument is going to be like here, because they do talk about the fact that we have a history of discrimination and prejudice and that we need to repair our troubled racial society. And I think that you can see that this indicates where the argument is going to go without listing 1, 2, 3 and not connecting the dots. Here's another bad one. The arguments that pornography should not be regulated because it promotes violence against women, objectifies women, and destroys relationships all miss the point of free speech. This was a weirdly awkward 1, 2, 3 here. Let's take a look at how it could be made better. None of the arguments in favor of regulating pornography are persuasive because they all base their points on the unverifiable and questionable assumption that the producers of pornography necessarily harbor ill will specifically to women. This one is definitely arguable. I think it lends itself to argument just by the fact that it sets such a strange standard. But nevertheless, it is arguable, and this is a better thesis than the first one. The thesis tests are these questions. Is this a complete sentence and not a question? You can't have a thesis question. You can only have a thesis statement. 2, does it imply an opposing argument? As I said before, a person should be reasonably able to disagree with you. 3, is the sentence a dead end, or does it call for additional information and explanation? If you think about it, anything that is absolutely factual is a dead end. It doesn't call for additional information and explanation. Only things that are opinions call for additional information and explanation. 4, does the statement make such a large claim that you believe the writer has no hope of proving it to be true in the space of 4 to 6 pages? Think back to the history of the English language thesis. Yes, you want to be sure that it is appropriate for the size of paper you're writing. 5, what evidence will you need to see before you will believe that the thesis is true? This would give you an opportunity in your thesis to hint at what evidence you are going to provide. All of these are just suggestions and ways to fix things that are not working with a thesis. I think the list of questions is really very helpful, and all of the rest of them try to give you specific information, specific ways to approach the problem of thesis, which is essential to any paper.